Other details I'm going to be adding to the hull are found on the table here. The T34 has a unique little bit of detailing in that the swing arm has a track and groove type assembly to it. The purpose for this I'm not exactly sure of what its function is. However, I think it has to do something with the alignment of the part. Anyway, this bit of detailing is absent on the Armortek kit. In order to add the detailing, I went ahead and fabricated the components that you see on the table. The components are made from casted metal, same metal alloy that was mentioned on the bump stops. By the way, this metal alloy is lead-free, in case anybody was wondering. These components are also a new relative addition to the EastCoastArmory.com product line, and in addition to the metal ones, I will also have resin variants as well, again for people who are working with static tanks and want to do it with a lot less of a budget compared to the metal versions that we have here. The pieces consist of two components. We have here the actual track and a securing plate. The way the system is designed is that this component here gets bolted to the side of the tank, and then this small little plate here gets fitted to the top with 3 more smaller fasteners. Now, all the parts that you see on the table here are enough for one side. The reason why I don't have the other components is that they have already been added to the other side of the tank, which I'll show shortly after this scene is up. And here's one of the guide rail mounts now secured to the vehicle. As you can see, it is held in place by 2 countersunk Phillips screws. Now, in order to mount this to the tank, I have to drill and tap the side hull of the tank, so measurements are going to be important when it comes time for the installation. However, with this procedure, the pieces are permanently attached to the tank and are not going to come off. Of course, Loctite is used on the fasteners. Next, I will install the cover plate, which will be secured on with 3 smaller to scale brass hex fasteners. Now, on the real T34, the swing arm would be mounted in this location that we have here. And on the real T34 swing arm, there would be a blade that comes out, and that blade would ride in this groove that we have here. This plate then, once it gets mounted on, would sandwich it in place. Now, the blade I'm not going to be adding to the Armortek swing arm, as due to the way the piece is machined. However, with this piece present, it does give you the detail that the piece does need to have, but you still have the same functionality unaltered from the Armortek part. And for a component like a swing arm for the suspension, this is very important, as you don't want to have any problems with this, as this is basically the lifeblood and the heart of the entire tank. And if this fails, you're going to have nothing but problems. Another bit of detailing that was added to the model, and is also a signature trait for the T34 series in general, and is also a new addition to the ECA product line, is that of the track pin realigners. On the T34, one of the design solutions to prevent the track pins from working themselves loose was this system that we have here. It consists of a simple half-moon shaped lump of steel, and on the real tank would be welded to the side of the hull. The way the system worked is that if the pins ever worked themselves loose while the tank was in operation, when the track would then circle around the hull again, the pin would hit this curved surface and it would knock the pin back into place where it needs to be on the track link. It's a very simple solution, but it was one that was very effective. This solution here was also copied by the Germans on the Panther and the Tiger I. The Panther system was very similar in design to this unit here, and the Tiger I system was a little bit more engineered compared to the simple blister. As for the ECA set, it consists of 2 of these cast metal components that are pre-machined and pre-threaded, and are also supplied with the fasteners. To mount them to the tank, you simply drill out the sections of the hull, and with the fasteners from the inside, you secure them firmly in place. The last thing I needed to do just before the installation of the swing arms was the addition of the weld beads. Now, prior to getting the weld beads on, I also had to do a little bit of body work in order to get the side as seamless as possible. On the stock Armortek T34, we had the fastener holes, like I mentioned before, for that of the side spring housings, which are to be added. With the modification that I made with the fasteners, I was able to add the bodywork to these locations here, thoroughly deleting them and leaving for a nice seamless appearance. In addition to removing those, I also had to remove the small little holes that were found on the side of the hull. The purpose of these holes are for that of the pivoting block that needs to be mounted on the inside. The Armortek kit has the pivoting block hole drilled directly through the side of the hull. On the real T34, this isn't the case, and the hull has absolutely no holes found on the upper portion that we have here. In order to plug up the holes, what I went ahead and did was I tooled on the lathe some resin plugs. The resin plugs were scaled to the same size of the hole that's found on the side of the plate here. After the plugs were cut, they were mounted to the side of the tank and then thoroughly blended in with that of the bodywork. Now the trick is the plugs have to be just the right thickness so that they don't inhibit the block from its installation. This did require some math, and after it was totally done, the blocks can get mounted to the tank, function absolutely perfectly, and will not have any unsightly protrusions on the side of the hull. Just before I get the piece into painting, I also went ahead and then sculpted on the weld beads. The weld beads were sculpted on the portion here of the sponson where it makes contact with the upper and lower hull, and I also added the sculpted weld beads to all of the bump stop components that I mentioned before. And here's the lower hull, now with its coat of primer added, and it's at this point here where I can start installing the suspension components. Really quick, you can see the bodywork that was done to the side of the hull is absolutely perfect. There are no indications of any sort of holes for either the fasteners or the little holes that were for the rotation plugs that were mentioned before. Moving to the outside portion of the suspension takes us to the following components. All of the kit components are strewn here on the table. Starting from left to right takes us to first the actual swing arm housings themselves. They are made of a single piece of CNC aluminum, and the quality is typical for that of the Armortek kits. Now, one thing that's unique about the T34 kit is that, unlike the other kits that Armortek has produced with the torsion bar type system, in which both the portion for the torsion bar axle as well as the wheel axle are threaded, on the Armortek T34 it's a little bit different. The hole, which normally on their German tanks, which would be for mounting onto the torsion bar, is actually just a pivot pin on the T34. And as you can see, that has no threading whatsoever. The other two sections here are fully tapped and threaded. These are for the axle as well as the pin that actually makes contact with that of the suspension spring. Moving up takes us to brass bushings. The brass bushing is what's going to fit inside of the pivot pin hole and is what separates the aluminum housing from that of the steel pivot pin. It's a nice machine piece, and no modifications need to be made to these pieces whatsoever. The tolerances are perfect for them. Moving on down takes us to the actual spring pin that we have. This will connect to the suspension spring and actually will be what holds up the suspension of the tank. It's made from CNC steel, and again, a nicely machined piece. Here we have the actual steel pivot pin. It's CNC'd steel, has two flats on the sides for that of rotating with a wrench when it comes time for the installation, and it is threaded on the opposite side. Finally, we have here the actual nut, which is what's going to hold everything together when it comes time for mounting inside of the vehicle. Over here and here we have two sample units that have been pre-assembled. And here you can see how the torsion bar assembles, or I should say the swing arm assembles out of box. This is not a torsion bar assembly. Now currently these two units here just have their parts threaded on with Loctite. However, I will of course be doing my pin modification, in which I will drill a hole through the tire section here and then put in a lock pin which will keep everything firmly in place and prevent anything from working itself loose when the tank is in operation. Now for anyone who has one of these kits, Care has to be exhibited by the builder with the orientation, the way the pieces are installed. This is important because you do have a left and right hand way these swing arms need to be assembled. Here we can see the left and right hand versions. As you can see, they are a mirror image of each other. This is important because when you're building these pieces, you could become complacent and just build all of them in the same manner. When it comes time for installation, you'll find out that this is not going to work, as there are right and left hand specific. And here are the swing arms going through their pinning procedure. Just like with all of the other swing arms that I do on these Armortek builds, I like to pin everything in place. Now, the difference between the T34 and something like the King Tiger or the Tiger 1 is that on the German vehicles, the swing arm is only comprised of a single unit on one side and the other, and one pin is required for each. On the T34, because we have two of these pins that are located on top of each other, you're going to need to pin both of them in place. And this is done with the same procedure that I frequently showcase in these videos. But on the T34, the hole that needs to be drilled has to be considerably a lot longer compared to the German tanks that get the same procedure done. As for the remainder of the pinning, this is exactly the same type of way that I've done on all of my other builds. Matter of fact, on the table here we have 3 examples of the pinning process. This first swing arm here, we have the hole drilled directly through. Here we have the actual pin being put in place, and for this build I'll be utilizing a metal nail. And it was slid into the hole. And then this is the completed unit. The nail has its top and bottom portions snipped off, and then it is smashed in with the hammer to compress it and fuse it to the aluminum, and makes it impossible for the pin to ever wiggle out. Once the pinning is all done, the swing arms will be ready for their painting procedure, to which the axle portions, which make contact with the road wheels, and in this case with the spring mechanism, will be masked up, as I don't want paint on these locations. After that, off into primer they go. And here we have the main swing arms now being fitted to the vehicle. Now, currently I'm working on the swing arms that are in the middle, and the front swing arm will be added shortly after the middle ones are all set. As for the swing arms, here we have the units here. They are now fully pre-painted. Now, I originally had a little bit of masking tape on this section here, which of course I removed. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put the pin mount, or the spring mount, on this pin here. Because this area here will get a lot of motion on it, I'm going to smear a little bit of grease on this section, which will of course protect the steel, prevent it from oxidizing or rusting, and will also help the other component glide on it with a lot more efficiency. Just slides on. Now, there is a retention fastener and cap which will be added. Those are currently in primer right now, will be added shortly after the filming of this scene. With the clearance I have in the hull, I could install this component like the way you see it on these two here, and then install the fastener after these pieces are affixed to the vehicle. After the spring mount is added, it's then time to install the bushing. The bushing simply just slides directly in place, and no adhesives or anything is needed for this procedure. After that is then time to install the main pin axle. Now, for this, I will be adding some grease to these two sections here, as they need to pivot inside of the bushing as well as on the inside portion of the tank. Of course, you don't want to get any grease on the threads, as this will be Loctited, and a fastener will hold this in place, and you don't want grease on there, as this piece here does not need to move, specifically once it's installed in place. As for the grease, add a small little smear this section here. And I will also add some on the main shaft. After the lubrication is added, the pin gets slid into place. Any extra grease I just want to wipe away, as this will interfere with the finish. Will be added to this shortly down the road. Okay, now with the pin added, I'm going to add some red Loctite to the threads. With the Loctite added, the piece will now be inserted into place. To insert the piece, the spring mount is positioned upward, and the whole unit is just guided into place and should just slide right in, like so. And here on the inside portion of the vehicle, you can see the threads. And with this nut, I will simply thread it into place. Once I bottom it out, I will then tighten everything with the wrenches. And here we have one complete side of the suspension complete, and I'm currently now in the process of completing the opposite side. Before I go over the installation of the spring mechanism and the other components in order to complete the suspension, first here we have one of the swing arms, and here you can see the pivot pin retention cap now fitted. The piece is a simple CNC little disc with a countersunk divot found inside, and it simply mounts to the threaded section found on the inside portion of the pin. The piece does a very good job in keeping everything properly in line and preventing it from moving around. Now, one thing to point out is that when it comes time for the installation of this piece, with the obvious tip to use Loctite, is that when it comes time to fastening on the fastener, you want to tighten it down all the way till it bottoms out. This piece here, no matter how much you tighten it, will not inhibit the rotation of the component. So you don't have to worry about tightening it where it will constrict the piece's movement. And I'm going to install this piece to the tank like I did on the opposite side, and then I'll go into more detail about the actual spring hookups and how everything gets finalized. Once all the swing arms are mounted to the hull, it's then time to start installing the spring equipment. Now, like I said before, the retention cap can be mounted onto the swing arm once the swing arm is already installed to the hull, like I mentioned before, and this is actually how I did it on the opposite side. But you can also do it before the installation. Whichever way the builder deems fit, both ways will yield the same exact result. Because of the bodywork mod that I mentioned previously with that of the rest and plug, to delete the present hole in the hull side for that of the pivot block, I need to add a small little spacer to this section here, as without it the pivot block can't move laterally, which can pop out the rest and plug and cause damage to the bodywork. To prevent that from happening, I simply add a 1/4 of an inch washer to be used as a spacer. The washer simply slides on, and then when it gets mounted to the hull, it will prevent the pivot block from moving in a lateral motion. Just before I put on the block here, I'm going to go ahead and get this piece lubricated on this side before I slip it into the tank's hull. And here's the pivot block, now with its grease added. Now I'm going to set this aside and grab one of the brass fittings. On the brass fitting, I'm going to add a little bit of Loctite. I'm using blue Loctite for this, just prior to threading it onto the pivot block. The reason why I'm using blue Loctite is that the purpose of this piece here is so that you can actually adjust and have some control of the height that the swing arms sit at. If I use red Loctite, this will secure the fitting in place. However, it will make any adjustments of the piece problematic if or when that need does arise. The blue Loctite holds it in place better and requires less torque to move the component if that need be does arise. Once the piece has its Loctite on, I'm going to go ahead and thread this guy all the way till I bottom it out. The reason why I'm going to bottom it out is because after assembling it on the other side, it seems like that is the height where these things could be at to get the proper height for the T34. Again, this is adjustable, and if anyone is working on their own T34, I recommend doing a little trial and error before committing to a certain size off the bat, as once you add the electronics and the turret, the weight of the vehicle will change somewhat and may require some hand fitting. Of course, on this build here, all of this is to come, as I've never done one of these Armortek T34s before, so I can't definitively say which height is the proper height for that of the running. And here's the fitting, now bottomed out onto the pivot block. It is now time for me to add the spring. Now the spring is very powerful and does snap into place. Once it's in place, it's not going to move anywhere. The next portion of the assembly has to do with that of the actual guide rod, or in this case it's a fastener which actually holds everything together. Setting the unit aside, I'm going to go ahead and add some grease to the smooth section here of the fastener, and again blue Loctite to the threaded section. The purpose of the grease is that when the suspension actually articulates, this entire rod will move up and down with the swing arm. So the extra lubrication added to the center portion will help it perform more efficiently than left dry. A little smear of the Loctite, of course, on the threads. Now the whole unit can be slid in place. Make sure there's no excess Loctite on the threads in order it doesn't get into this section here of the unit. The setup now can be bolted to the pivoting block that is found on the swing arm. When it comes time for the installation of the spring, you have to first get the spring onto the pivot pin that we have here. Now the piece should clip on, and then after that you need to, with an Allen wrench, bolt the fastener to the pin, as this holds the entire unit together. Getting it lined up. And then just thread the unit till the threads stop and it bottoms out. Once the fastener is bolted to the swing arm, the entire unit is a self-contained piece. This includes the fastener, the spring, the pivot block, and also the swing arm. Now, when it comes after this point here, it is now time to slide the block into the pre-machined peg that was found on the side of the hull. Now it's important to point out that the washer spacer that I added in the previous scene is going to be affixed on the inside portion of the hull, as this is the portion that needs to prevent the peg from moving, overstretching, and possibly knocking out the bodywork plug that I mentioned earlier. As for slipping it on, there should be some wiggle room, and the piece will simply go into its place. It is at this point here where I can now add on the housing plate that was also showcased in another scene. Just before I can install on the housing block, you'll see that I went ahead and added some grease to the center portion here. The purpose of the grease is that this is a section of the housing block that makes contact with the pivoting block, and the extra lubrication does help with the efficiency of the part. As for the installation, it should just slide directly onto the fasteners that I mentioned before. Wipe off any extra grease that remains. Now I can affix the housing to the side of the hull with that of the 3 fasteners that we have here. Of course, a drop of Loctite is going to be added to the fasteners just prior to the tightening of the part. The final component to add is that of a brass fitting nut over the other brass fitting that we have here on the pivot block. The purpose of this nut is that this gives an extra bit of torque to squeeze the fitting onto the pivot block, and will prevent it from backing out or loosening during operation. We're using again blue Loctite, add some on the threads. Now the piece can be added in the previous assembly, however I like to add it at the very end, as the piece does fit over the fastener and does make no contact with the part. I'll simply thread it on and then tighten it with the wrench when it bottoms out. Once everything is done, you can test the suspension by pulling up on the swing arm, and you'll see the fastener move up and down as it's tied in with the swing arm. If I let go, the spring rockets the swing arm back into place where it's supposed to be at its home location. The motion feels very smooth, and the spring is not making contact or binding with any of the other components or hull fittings that are found on the hull. It's at this point now where I can progress with the other suspension pieces completing the side. And here's the suspension on the outside of the model. You can see the units actuating. Now, it's also important to point out that I actually have to put a lot of force to get the suspension units to move. Now, it's not because they're binding or being inhibited by anything. It's just purely from the strength of the springs. They're very stout and do require a bit of oomph to get them to move, which is exactly what you want for something like a suspension on a tank model. This should be more than adequate at doing the job at hand. Now, with the suspension in the rest of the vehicle done, it's now time to focus on the front units. Now, the design of the front suspension system is very different compared to the rest. Instead of the system that you just see me install, where you have the housing and the spring, which is totally enclosed, on the front units, the springs are actually exposed. On the inside, we have a yoke type system, and we have a different type of spring mounting pin. It looks very similar to the ones used on the other pieces, but for the ones in the front, they're actually thinner, and these are properly labeled in the instructions and also on the parts bags. And so you do have to pay attention to them to make sure you don't get them intermixed. It's very easy to tell them apart, as the other ones are not interchangeable with this one here, but you can easily accidentally mount this to the other swing arm units if you weren't paying attention. As for the installation, I'm going to go ahead and quickly smear some grease on both sides of this unit, which of course will aid it with its suspension when it comes time for actually functioning. With the piece on, I'm going to keep it bolted on with that of a fastener. And here's the pivoting system now mounted to the swing arm. Now, if you'll notice, the fastener has the tool head on the outside with the nut portion on the inside. When it comes time to mounting into the hull, I've noticed that there's more clearance with the nut portion than with the other end, which is why it's important to get your orientation correct when it comes time for the installation of this piece. As at this point here, I can add the grease to the spindle section of the axle, as this is going to be pivoting inside of the brass bushing, which was mentioned and installed in an earlier portion of the video. As for the grease, it's the same type of application and procedure that I do on all of these Armortek builds. While working on the front swing arm system, I need to make some alterations to the stock kit in order to have the piece function with more freedom. As you can see, here I have the longer sections. These here are the stock components which are actually intended to be used for the front suspension. Pieces like the spring and the brass section here are the same and interchangeable with the other ones on the rest of the suspension set. What is different is that of the fastener. Now, these two fasteners here both started off as the same way, which is that of this longer one. Now, this longer fastener is very similar to the one that is used on the rest of the suspension, but is a little bit shorter. Here we can see the difference compared to the one used for the rest of the suspension on the side. Even though the front one is shorter than the normal one, I found out that for the suspension to have more clearance, the longer fastener that is supplied with the kit is not going to be sufficient and needs to be modified. Directly next to it, I have the same fastener that was modified in order for it to have better clearance with that of the front of the hull. Once the pieces are installed, you'll see what I'm referring to in more depth. And here we have the inside of the vehicle, and the one unit is fully assembled. As you can see, the amount of clearance required for the installation of this piece in the front is very, very confined. This has to do with the front shape of the armor. Having the kit components left stock will lead to problems with the actual installation. First, just getting the pieces to fit inside, but most importantly, having the suspension piece actually function. Remember, the fastener does need some clearance for it to go up and down. If you follow the kit, the fastener is going to make direct contact with the upper hull, thus removing any possibility of the suspension arm to actually function. In addition to that, you can also see why I had to shorten the spring. This had to also do for that of the orientation of the front swing arm so that it lines up with the other swing arms on the hull. In my situation, when I installed the piece with the spring left fully extended, the swing arm dipped down way below the appropriate level for that of a T34. In addition to shortening the spring and the fastener, like I mentioned, I also had to make clearance for that of the top portion here for the brass. The brass fitting, the threaded section, needed to have been shortened in order for the fastener, which is also now shortened, to have some leeway for it to move up and down. To illustrate the new modifications in action, I'm going to start actuating the front swing arm. Here you can see the piece in operation, and it has just enough clearance for the piece to function and not to bottom out on the front plate. Now, even though I did have to shorten the spring, it's important to note that the spring is still very powerful and taut, which is what you want, again, for a suspension piece, and will definitely prevent the front from sagging or prematurely dipping when in operation. The same procedure has to be done to the opposite side. When it comes time to installing the unit from the opposite side, as you can see, I went ahead and removed the pivoting block, which was installed in a previous scene, in order for me to get the unit pre-assembled as a sub-assembly, as installing the unit as a sub-assembly is a lot easily done in this confined space, as opposed to trying to do it like I did on the other suspension pieces with installing it as I go. This again has to do with the shape of the frontal hull armor. And here's the front suspension parts, now fully shortened and ready for installation to the front yoke. Now, in addition to trimming the parts to their shorter lengths, I also went ahead and tweaked the shape of the spring. Because the spring was cut and ground down, I tightened the last ring on the vise in order for it to grab and lock onto this section here. Because of the shape of the spring, I felt that with prolonged pressure that it could snap over this part here, which can cause us some problems. By bending the piece on the vise helps it stay in its proper place with more ease. Because this piece is not currently yet installed, I can thread everything together as one unit, and then, like I said before, slide the entire sub-assembly in place. And here's the sub-assembly unit here, ready for installation. Now, it's important to point out that unlike the other suspension blocks where I have to put the spacer washer on, that's not necessary for the front unit. I could simply just drop it in right after the filming of this take. With a few taps of the rubber mallet, the piece gets seated in place, and now I can lock the unit together with that of the locking plate, which again was also showcased earlier. Once the internals are mounted, it is then time to install the external swing arm. Now, the external swing arm locks onto the spindle with that of a locking pin. Now, for this model here, I was going to utilize that of a roll pin. Unfortunately, the roll pin I have on hand are not the correct size required to lock this in place, so I'm going to have to acquire a new one, which more likely this will be done and discussed in the next video update. In addition to that, the next component that needs to be focused on is that of the front idler mounts. And then, of course, we're going to then move on to the rest of the suspension, namely that of the tracks, the wheels, sprockets, and the front idler. Of course, all this will be discussed in the next video update. And with that, that wraps up this project update video for this 1/6 scale, radio-controlled Armortek Russian T34 85. If you like this video, stop by and like us on Facebook, where there are more photographs of this particular build that have been posted since project start, as well as the other 1/6 and smaller scale builds that are found on the ECA channel. In addition to that, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks for watching.